Diversity within a business arena is about driving the commercial, and you can have very diverse organisations, but again, it doesn't necessarily mean they're inclusive. And I think the top-down approach works very well because, as Kate says, behaviours are generally copied, and role models in organisation are very powerful. So if a CEO, be it female or be it male, are going to have very different influences on different individuals throughout an organisation. So personally, I feel the behaviour will get lost because eventually those who are in more junior positions will end up copying the bad behaviour of those role models if they themselves are not driving the agenda.
About 4 or 5 years ago, I did a presentation at Whitehall, and this guy was a CEO of an IT company here in the city, multi-millionaire, and he came up to me and he said, "Steve, it's absolutely amazing what you've done. You've done all these world records, you've got your own business, you work in education, da-di-da-di-da. You really are a credit to society." I said, "Thank you." I said, "Why haven't you got the confidence to employ somebody that's different?" And he said, "It's down to lack of education, Steve." Because he actually thought at that time that to employ somebody for a position who's got a disability, he wasn't just responsible for their wages, he was then responsible for computers if they needed them, ramps if they needed them, widening doors if they needed them. And he said, and I agree with him, if government actually had put the appropriate white paper together to support disability in employment, it would make life a lot easier.
Part of the research we've done for the National Equality Standard is to speak to a range of different organisations around what they consider the starting point is to really get the message home. Lots of that's around the business case, as we suggested. So I think the general consensus of the research that we've carried out is it's everybody's responsibility in terms of ownership. But if the leadership doesn't drive that and doesn't communicate what the specific business case is for that organisation, because of course there's the sort of financial, the moral case, there's what makes it really understandable to the rest of the organisation. So for me, it's about leadership owning it, visible role models. It's about them having almost a day-to-day active involvement in a variety of different diversity initiatives, and then really truly understanding what diversity means as a business case for them, and then effectively communicating that.
The other thing that speaks to some of this is, it's back to the part of, who owns diversity. Is it from the bottom or from the top? And there's an element, of course, which is, as any leader in the organisation, whether you're a supervisor or some other more exalted title, it's what characteristics are you injecting amongst your team to create a diverse workforce? And where is the management training?
Ownership needs to be at the top, and we have encouraged companies to literally, at least for a while, and the verdict is still out, but at least for a while, to make sure that diversity is very much at the top of the agenda or at board level. Whoever is holding that responsibility, they need to be represented and have a very clear say right at the top. There have been too many initiatives from the bottom up, and I agree with your point about bottom up. Nevertheless, if the people at the top are not owning it and, very importantly, putting the resources behind it, because diversity is costly. It is expensive, but it's also expensive not to do, discrimination cases, etc., reputation, etc. However, unless it's led from the top, the time, the energy, the spend is not there. It's never there. It's never adequate.
Yes, responsibility, I think, lies right at the top, but I think that's got to be systematically and structurally built into the policies, the procedures, the operational plans, the strategic plans, the performance management, the impact assessment, the monitoring, the evaluation, the outcomes that you look at. And it's not just from a cost point of view. In our case, it's not just about, it's not the profit motive that's driving us, but it really is the ethical kind of dimension that's driving us. And it's also about accountability. We cannot be a global player in the 21st century and accountable to 7 billion odd people unless we actually behave with integrity in the way that we approach and deliver on diversity.
I think that's the issue. So we're wanting to be owned and signed off. I mean, financially it has to be signed off at board level. Decision-making processes have to be signed off. But boards themselves, not always the case, but typically are not as representative as we'd like to be as we go up the tier. And therefore, we're trying to ask something of folk that perhaps haven't got the ability to give that consideration.
But is that not down to the education that we were talking about earlier, haven't we?
Well, it's also down to kind of the recruitment and the promotion and the progression throughout the tiers of the organisation, isn't it?
I've not come across any board members across government who say this is not important to me. They all say this is important to me, and they all say, actually, I know when it's working when the people in the organisation tell us it's working, when the customer who uses our services understands that it's working. And so it's a measure that's, you know, a kind of feelings measure, experience measure with our people as customer and the employees. So engagement surveys and customer surveys and other indicators tell the board whether something's working or not.
What percentage of belief do we actually have about that then?
So, I mean, the issue is, I mean, that's the most reliable indicator you'll have. The people's experience is the most reliable indicator we have. I could give the board lots of strategies, and we have a really good one, I think. And they've had many people in as diversity professionals, others come in and give advice about how things could be done. Some of them not done a great job, some made it worse, some made it better. What they're looking for, I think boards want, is some confidence that actually the advice and support they're getting, the processes and systems we have in place, the measures that we have are the right set. The board needs to say, actually, this is not a great place to be. What do I need to do to make this better? How can I drive a better outcome in the reading that I get? But they want real measure, they want real indicators. A point of impact is the impact on the customer, the impact on the user, the employee, and put your measures there.
I saw a change over time which started from it's a good thing to do, you know, it's an organisation that probably had those kind of values, shifted to a direct correlation between the outputs, the programmes, the content, what the audiences thought, as the BBC became, I think, much more in tune with what does the audience want as opposed to what are we going to give the audience. The audience changing by being less passive and the audience wanting to be much more involved in the kind of content and sometimes making their own content. So for me, I don't think the BBC's probably done enough, but it's, you know, it's certainly invested a lot of energy and certainly a lot of resource into doing it. The key for me when things started to change was when people started to see a connection between the workforce, the kinds of ideas that were generated in terms of creativity of content, and how that then was portrayed in terms of the audience. And people could see a connection between the kind of people you see on air and on screen, the makeup of the teams that generated the ideas in the first place. And I think that then, if you can get in an ideal world to a point where you can make the connection between the two, so your end product, whatever that is, I think that's incredibly helpful.
I think that's a separate bit of the debate. What I'm kind of really is do we need to convince boards? I'm not absolutely convinced we have a big challenge here. Do we need to put a persuasive business case before them? I don't think so. I think they want to understand what the challenge or the problem is in the organisation that we're trying to solve. What is the problem we're trying to solve? And once they're clear what the problem is we're trying to solve, then I think they'll be much more engaged in saying, actually, I'm prepared to support this because it makes good
business sense. But surely, if we pull all those weaknesses and turn them into a positive as to a negative, they're going to have a better workforce to start with. The people are all going to be engaged with the processes, and as a result of that, the bottom line is going to increase. And ultimately, that's what business are looking at. I think it's those positive aspects of equality and diversity in increasing their share in the market that is going to be the motivator.
I think they get that. I don't think they know what to do differently.
I had a long conversation with Kingston University last week, and they're recognising that their student base has changed dramatically over the last 10 years with an influx of ethnicity, second, third generation. The landscape in an area, Kingston in Surrey, which was predominantly white, has rapidly changed its demographic. And I think that education piece then, if you're a lecturer at a university and all of a sudden your audience has changed, you need to reflect what you're saying in order to keep connecting with that audience. And that comes back to Joe's point in terms of the diversity within corporates. You're not there trying to paint a picture of what they should look like. You're holding up a mirror and saying this is what you suddenly look like. And from the board situation where it's generally been led from traditional values, to be a board member you've generally had to have come from some form of privileged background or privileged upbringing in terms of your education, because boards want to select what they feel are the best talent, the brightest talent, to come from the best university after generation after generation after generation. I think when a board suddenly starts to move so far away from the coalface, because industry at people level has changed so quickly, it's at that point that the scariness comes in, because they suddenly feel disconnected maybe from even who their customer base is.
Clearly society is changing very quickly. I think it's open to debate whether organisations are changing very quickly.
Yeah.
So if we pick up Steve's strand around the importance of education, what role does either onboarding or your internal socialisation with a new company, how should that play in creating the conditions for organisations to keep their promises and make the most out of their talent in the future? So specifically, what's the role onboarding should be playing against this diversity and inclusion agenda?
It's absolutely vital. Absolutely vital, because it's your funnel, it's your it's what's coming in, it's the future, it's what the organisation is going to look and feel and breathe like, isn't it? So I think the attraction piece, the whole onboarding piece, the education piece at the starting journey from day one, the minute I arrive in an organisation, is what's going to set my understanding of what's good practice, what's inappropriate behaviour, what's conduct here.
If you're looking at sort of disability confidence or diversity confidence, if you just start with that, just before we start, it's okay for you to get it wrong, because the best thing you can do is have a dialogue. Remember, we're all people. You could actually leave the room at that point and have made a difference, in fact, because you've got people thinking slightly differently. So those are kind of, you know, looking at your practical point, Raj. Can I just pick up on the induction question, if I may? Because I think there's two elements to this. One is there is an opportunity at induction, as we've debated, to instil values and corporate values and explain where we stand. The other opportunity at induction is to lose that diversity that we've brought in and clone it into what the organisational norm is. Certainly big graduate recruiters are becoming increasingly aware of their ability to do this. You know, I mean, I'm of a certain age, looking around the room, I'm of a certain age beyond quite a few of you on the table. And, you know, the sort of 20-somethings of this world now are at university or college or working in the shop or whatever. They are in a diverse world. You know, they don't think about diversity, they don't think about inclusion, that their world is very mixed and different and multicultural and multifaceted, and that's fantastic. You know, if we get them into, and people, you know, like the Big Four with an E&Y, you have such a tremendous opportunity there to set a different standard in bringing that diverse mix in and keeping it diverse by including its differences, really. So I think those are the two elements.
Sorry, very good point, Kate.
The education point is, and we'll say this a lot today, if we get it right at education, then we don't need to be having these debates. I mean, we're saying that a lot, but I, a couple of years ago, had the great privilege of doing a speech at BT Tower, and it was a great privilege. And I was leaving for that, and I was just talking to my daughter, who at that age would have been about 9, 10, and she volunteers at Riding for the Disabled and has done since she was little. It was the only way she could get her hands on a pony, frankly, was the starting point. So nothing more philanthropic than that. But, you know, it's progressed and it's been good for her. But she's sponsored a particular little boy since he was tiny. And she said, "Oh, Mum, Billy had the most fantastic ride today, and he was telling me about Blue Peter." She said, "I don't know what he's going to do with his life, but every detail of everything you've ever said to that boy, he remembers." So I said to her, as she would, "Oh, and what's the nature of his disability, darling?" And she said, "Oh, I'm really sorry, Mum. I've never asked him, and I've not noticed. God, did he arrive on a wheelchair? I can't remember." Do you know, I've no idea, Mummy. And she spent weeks, if not months, with this child. And it just wasn't relevant to her to even notice. And you think, God, if we don't knock that out of the child before she reaches employment, we're sussed on, we've got it sorted.
It's like when I walk